if I asked the 100 people here in this audience, what did British men and women do in the Second World War? I imagine that most people will be familiar with the fact that men went into the armed forces to defend the country. And probably they know about women going into the labour market to fill that vacuum left by men. They may even be aware that immediately upon the outbreak of the war, conscription was implemented. So men chose to go into either the RAF, into the army, or into the navy. They may have seen wartime films that celebrated the sacrifices that these men gave. And they may have walked past monuments that commemorated these men. They may also be familiar with women who went into civil defence, into industry and the auxiliary services. And they may also have seen those memorials that are celebrating the achievements and participation of women in this total war. But what I reckon they won't know is that there were a large number of civilian men on the home front. And even when you interview and talk to men and women who lived through this period, they often erase the civilian man from their accounts. So Janet Miller, who was a teacher that we interviewed in 2008, noted, there were no men. The men were all in the forces. College was manless. There were a few, I think, who were maybe medically unfit, only 2 or 3. But it was a time of man's scarcity. And television programs and films in the post-war period have reinforced this notion that the home front was populated by women, by the elderly, by young children, and by physically unfit men who were prevented from going into the armed forces. But that isn't the whole story. There were large numbers of civilian men on the home front. Men such as my grandpa, Jack Gale, who was a policeman before being sent into the army later on in the war to fight in Burma. We don't know about men such as him. And it's not just policemen. It's firefighters, it's farmers, it's miners, it's industrial workers, and it's scientists. And we haven't heard about these men's experiences at all. Why is that? And why were these men prevented from going into the forces? The answer is this document, the Schedule of Reserved Occupations. This was a list of jobs that prevented men who were undertaking jobs that were seen as essential for the maintenance of services on the home front, or were doing things that were key to the prosecution of the war from going into the armed forces. So this included roles such as foundry worker, shipyard worker, dock worker, pharmacist. And there were some surprising entries as well on this Schedule of Reserved Occupations. So gardener, French polisher, and jeweller. And the reason why is because their skills were needed to grow vegetables or to work with precision instruments. Now, each of the occupations listed, and there were about 300, and it was done in alphabetical order from architect right the way through to zinc manufacturer, had an age of reservation listed next to it. And this was the age at which these men were prevented from going into the armed forces. So the lower the age of reservation for a particular occupation, the more crucial it was seen to be. So a lighthouse keeper, for example, was reserved at the age of 18, a coast guard at the age of 25, whereas a shop assistant or a trade union official was reserved at the age of 35. So these are large numbers of men on the home front that we're not aware of. And what I think is so surprising is that they completely outnumber the men who are in the military. So even in 1940, during the Battle of Britain, we have a ratio of civilian men to military men as 5-to-1. And throughout the war, we have civilian men being released into the forces, like my grandpa. So in June 1945, when the army is at its strongest in terms of numbers, the ratio is still 2-to-1. 2/3 of men remained on the home front, over 10 million, and only 1/3, less than 500,000 men, 4.5 million men went into the services. So at no time during the war did military men outnumber civilian men. And yet we have completely forgotten about this. So myself and 2 colleagues set out to try and rescue the civilian man from obscurity. Even the youngest wartime worker in this period would have been in his late 80s when we interviewed in 2013 and 2014. So it was absolutely crucial to capture their voices before this generation is lost. And we conducted 56 interviews with men who during the war were predominantly young, single, working class, and mainly engaged in heavy industry or manual occupations. And many of the men that we interviewed, exactly half in fact, were content with their wartime participation. They felt that they were doing their bit for the war effort. So for example, John Dixon, who worked in a Glasgow shipyard, recalled there was no point in robbing Peter to pay Paul, or taking a skilled engineer out of skilled engineering to be a soldier. And similarly, Alexandra Davidson, who was a boat builder in Portsmouth, said that it was no good having sailors if you'd got nothing to sail them in. If you hadn't got any boats, the soldiers couldn't fight without rifles. So these men felt very secure in their civilian work. They knew that they were participating, and they carved out a place for themselves that was equal with the men that went into uniform. And we have visual depictions of this in posters, which celebrated this kind of parity or equality of sacrifice. So put it there, the series of posters where we have this brawny, muscular arm of a shipyard worker and a Royal Navy man who are crushing the German U-boat with the shape of a shark, the face of a shark. We also have given both barrels, and I think this is a visual depiction of Churchill's statements that the front line runs through the factories. The workmen are soldiers with different weapons, but the same courage. And this was certainly known during the war. So Mr. Latchford, in his diary, wrote, "The government is drawing a parallel between men in the services and men working on the home front." And it's not just in visual sources such as posters, we also see it in film. So Humphrey Jennings, who was a celebrated documentary filmmaker in the Second World War, made a film called Diary for Timothy. And it was essentially a record for this newborn baby called Tim, and it celebrated Bill, the engine driver, Alan, the farmer, and Goronwy, the coal miner, celebrating the civilian participation in the war effort.
But you were part of the war even before you were born. You see, this was total war. Everyone was in it. It was everywhere, not only on the battlefields, but in the valleys where Goronwy, the coal miner, carries his own weapons to his own battlefront, in scenery which isn't exactly pretty. If you looked across the countryside of England, that is beautiful. You could see Alan, the farmer. He has spent the last 5 years of war reclaiming the land and making it fertile. He has been fighting against the forces of nature all his life. And now, with a mortal enemy on us, he has to fight harder than ever. In London, Bill, the engine driver, looks out of his cabin at his battlefront. No longer taking holidaymakers to the sea, but taking the miners' coal, the farmers' crops, the fighting men's ammunition, to where they have to go. Goronwy, Alan, and Bill are all fighting in their ways.
And many of the men that we interviewed also felt that they were fighting in their own ways. My grandpa also felt quite content to be a policeman on the home front. And actually, it was when he was de-reserved and was conscripted into the army to go and fight in Burma that actually he felt really frustrated. He was married, he had 2 young children, and he felt that he was already doing his bit. This was a second call on his duty. That wasn't the experience of all men, however. And some of the men that we interviewed, exactly half, 28, were really frustrated that they were prevented by the state from going into the armed forces. They talk about being stuck and fastened down by being in a reserved occupation and attempted to evade their reserve status. And undoubtedly, it was their youthfulness that was the key. So these men were much younger than my grandpa. This was the key to why they wanted to serve in military uniform. So Ron Spedding, who worked in Durham at a railway, in his memoir, noted, as very young men, we'd actually looked forward to the day we could join the armed forces and do our bit for king and country. We would often imagine and fancy ourselves in a military uniform, parading behind a brass band and sporting medals received for courage and valour. We really did believe that the most important thing in life was to fight and destroy the enemy, win the war, and earn a share in the final victory and the glory. I remember feeling peeved and also a little guilty when some of my friends joyously told me they'd been released and were off to join the Air Force. Now, I think in that testimony, the frustration there is really palpable. He talks about feeling peeved. He talks about feeling guilty. And many of the men that we interviewed referred to sentiments of anger and jealousy, and some of them constructed very moving accounts of how they saw themselves as lesser men in relation to the military man. One man even said, "I was a nobody." Many of these men did try to evade their reserve status, try to escape it and get into the forces, and they did this repeatedly, and they were knocked back. However, a few of our interviewees were successful. One man was a miner, William Ramage, and he said, "I'd been trying, and they wouldn't take me because of my employment. Eventually, I went into rebellion. I stopped work. I was idle for 4 weeks. Then a letter came through the door. You're required to report to Gordon Barracks, Aberdeen, for military service. Oh dear, my heart surged. You wouldn't believe the eruption that took place in my heart." And at that point in the interview, when he said, "My heart surged," he leapt off his armchair. So the sentiments that drove him, that he remembered nearly 70 years later, was so incredibly vivid still in the oral history interview. And certainly the policy of reservation could invoke very strong emotion. John Profumo, during the Second World War, was a Conservative MP, but he was also in the army. And he noted in the House of Commons, there are still in this country great numbers of men who ought to join up. Young men like myself, capable, fit, with the muscle but without the will. Men who are hiding behind the cloak of what are called reserved occupations. I could lay my hands on them, on many such men, although I'd prefer to lay my feet on them. Up and down the country, there are men who should be joining the colours before we make all our women into soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Let us rout out these people and put them into the forces. And inflammatory comments such as these were not uncommon. So we have other MPs saying in the House of Commons that these men were somehow evading their patriotic duty, that they were scrimjacks and scrimshanks. There was a sense that they were cowards. And actually, in this context, we see the rekindling of the World War I phenomenon of white feathers being handed out. The white feather is a symbol of cowardice. This was an accusation of cowardliness. So the white feather was the feather tail from a gamecock, and it was seen as an inferior sign of breeding. So there was something wrong with these men, that they were unmanly, that they were lesser men because they weren't going into the forces, that they weren't donning uniform. And tragically, we know in the Second World War that some of the men that were given white feathers actually committed suicide. And it wasn't just men in the reserved occupations that were the subject of these kind of remarks. Men who were expecting to go into the forces, but on receipt of their papers actually found that they were conscripted into the mines, what we know as Bevin boys, also experienced this. So one interviewee said, "We did feel like outsiders, and mainly because there was a resentment because we weren't in uniform. And some people thought we were either deserters, draft dodgers. Some people even thought we were conscientious objectors. This brought a bit of suspicion on you." So their masculinities are being called into question by the fact that they were not able to go into uniform, that the state had prevented them from doing so. Now, the Bevin boys, I think people do know about them, and they are involved in kind of Remembrance Sunday events and commemorative activity. There are also two of the reserved occupations that have been memorialised. So next time you're in Dover, look out on the seafront for this memorial to the Merchant Navy. Or if you're near St Paul's Cathedral in London, then you might be able to see this National Firefighters Museum called Blitz. And it's striking, I think, that these two reserved occupations have been chosen for commemoration. They were obviously both in uniform, so there are really close connections there with the men in the forces, but also they sustained very heavy casualties. The Merchant Navy were the ones that were in ships that were trying to bring food into Britain and obviously were the target of German attacks by submarine. And the firefighters were there trying to put out the flames from the aerial bombing, the Blitz. I think it's absolutely crucial that we remember these men, that they enter into public consciousness about the sacrifice that they gave for this country. But I also think it's important to remember the men whose roles were not so closely connected to the war effort, the policemen and the farmers and the engine drivers. It's important to know all of these men's experiences, as this is part of the collective endeavour of fighting this people's war. And while these men were in reserved occupations, I, at least, do not think that they were men in reserve. Thank you.